Sonic, the heart of your system.
What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kickaroo, and these are the brand new Ryzen Threadripper 3000 processors from AMD, so the new high-end desktop flagships. Let's take a closer look at these beasts. So if we start off with the new flagship 32-core 64-thread 3970X, that comes in at a price tag of $1,999 US, so probably about £2,000 in the UK, because, you know, we're Brits, we get ripped off, right? And then the second in command Threadripper 3960X is 24 cores, 48 threads, and that's $1,399 US, so probably about £1,400 in the UK. Fundamentally, these two processors replace AMD's Threadripper 2970WX and 2990WX as the now highest in command AMD non-server CPUs. I say these are the highest core count CPUs for AMD's lineup currently because yes, AMD has now confirmed that we will be seeing a 64 core version of Threadripper in 2020, so that's pretty cool, something to get excited for. Right now though, 32 cores and 24 cores, these are the best Threadripper has to offer. So when we break down the Threadripper 3000 parts, these are of course based on the Zen 2 architecture and TSMC 7nm process technology. Both of these chips use 8 CCXs in 4 CCDs, so you get 4 core chiplets, and then obviously you've got the central I/O die that is separate from the chiplets. So the 3970X, the 32 core, is obviously using 4 fully populated CCDs, so 4 8-core chiplets. And the 3960X is still using 4 chiplets, but they're 75% populated, so 6 cores apiece to give you that 24 cores. The 8-core chiplets especially, but also the 6-core chiplets are going to be in hot demand and competition with the EPYC parts, so we can only cross our fingers that availability is going to be pretty strong here. So when we look at frequencies, the 32 core comes in a 3.7 GHz base and 4.5 GHz maximum boost clock. And the 24-core 3960X comes in at slightly higher on the base, so 3.8 GHz base, and still up to 4.5 on the maximum boost clock. It's also impressive when we look at the speeds for last year's 24-core and 32-core Threadripper parts. So the 2970WX and the 2990WX were 3 GHz base, and on the all-core generally operated below 3.5 GHz. For the 32-core part, it was closer to 3 GHz. So the fact that these are 3.7 and 3.8 base clock is quite impressive, and that just speaks to the power of TSMC's 7nm process and the smart design that AMD has adopted with Zen 2. So in terms of cache, you get obviously 128 megabytes of L3 because you get the 4 full chiplets with the 8 CCXs, and this is the case on both of the chips. So the total for the 3970X is 144 megabytes of L2 plus L3 cache, and the total for the 24-core chip is 140 megabytes of L2 plus L3. So the TDP for these parts is actually increased versus the previous generation Threadripper flagships, and they were power hungry, high energy CPUs in their own right. So we're actually talking 280 watts for both of these chips. And of course, you know, TDP is somewhat of a pointless metric, but in the Precision Boost 2 algorithm, that TDP number for these chips is the power that they will be allowed to use for the package in the Precision Boost 2 algorithm. So we will see them consuming about 280 watts, unlike some of the Ryzen mainstream parts, which have a different value for PPT versus TDP. Typical high core count EPYC is 225 watts and can be configured up to 240 watts. So obviously AMD's putting that extra 40 watts on there so that the frequencies can be pushed further than EPYC. So if we look at the basic overall view of the I/O connectivity, on the memory front we get quad channel memory support, and this is up to 256 gigabytes with currently validated configurations because of the 32 gig DIMMs coming on the market. So that's good to see, same as what Intel's offering with Cascade Lake X. Threadripper actually does support ECC memory, so you can use that if you like, but it is down to the motherboard vendor to implement the support. In terms of frequency, it's slightly complex to analyze without looking at a chart, but fundamentally you get the same memory controller as the Zen 2 based Ryzen 3000 CPUs. You can support up to DDR4 3200 MHz in 1 DIMM per channel configuration by default out of the box. When you're switching to say 8x8 gig DIMMs, then you're down to 2933 official support. And if you're doing 8x16 or 8x32, that's 2666 official support. Of course, if you've got a motherboard that allows overclocking or the application of specific XMP type profiles, you can run 3600 no problem, like we've seen with other Zen 2 chips, but it does depend on the modules and some of the other factors. The same suggestion for using DDR4 3600 applies as with Zen 2. So beyond 3600, you will switch the divider to a 2:1 ratio for the memory controller clock versus the memory clock. So that's important to understand because that imparts a latency penalty like we saw with Zen 2. Of course, this can be manually configured and manually tweaked, but AMD's guidance is to stick to 3600 megahertz with good timing such as C16. Seems like a reasonable configuration. 3200 C14 is also a pretty good configuration for this in our opinion. When it comes to PCIe lanes, the CPU itself has a total of 64 PCIe Gen 4 lanes available. Now the split of these is slightly complex, but AMD gives a graphic to explain this. So first of all, you've got 2 sets of 4-lane links. So that's 2x4 connections direct from the CPU, specifically for those purposes. So that's 8 lanes used out of the 64. We've now got 56 lanes remaining. 48 of those are general purpose lanes that can be used for expansion slots. That leaves us with 8 lanes remaining. Those 8 lanes are specifically used to communicate with the new TRX40 chipset. So AMD is giving you a fat 8-lane PCIe Gen 4 connection between the CPU and the chipset, which is new and is highly impressive. That 8-lane connection to the chipset is about 16 gigabytes a second of bandwidth. So when you compare that to X399, which was a by 4 Gen 3 link to the chipset, when you compare it to Intel's X299, they were using Gen 3 by 4 connections, which were 4 gigabytes a second of bandwidth. Ryzen 3000 on AM4 and X570 took that to a PCIe Gen 4 by 4 link, which was 8 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. Now we've got a 8-lane fat link with Gen 4, which is 16 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. Now that might not sound important, but it really is. If you look at a high-end Gen 3 NVMe SSD, so like a Samsung 970, one of those SSDs is going to pretty much saturate your CPU to chipset link when it's running at full speed. If you want to put RAID 0 or multiple SSDs accessed simultaneously on the chipset, you're going to run into a bottleneck. That is not the case with an 8-lane connection. It's a really smart move by AMD. Quite frankly, it's extremely overdue. The market should have changed this a long time ago, but it's good to see AMD finally leveraging the PCIe connectivity in a really smart approach to link the chipset. Now, as you can guess, there's going to be some negative coming here, so higher TDP parts, higher core counts, promised for the very near future, and a new fat connection to the chipset. So clearly the caveat is the new socket. So these chips are using the new TRX4 socket, and that is not compatible with the old TR4 socket. It's physically the same, but it is not compatible. So your old X399 motherboard cannot be used with these new Threadripper 3000 CPUs, and vice versa. So you can't use the older CPUs from the TR4 socket in a new TRX40 STRX4 motherboard. So clearly, that's a bit of a bummer, but when you look at the higher TDP that is promising higher sustained boost frequencies, when you're looking at the scalability, which AMD justifies as one of the reasons for the new platform and new socket, is future scalability, and we're going to see that pretty soon in 2020 with a 64-core part. And when you think about the quadruple bandwidth, so the by 8 Gen 4 link between the CPU and the chipset, they seem like pretty valid reasons to switch to a new socket and a new overall platform, in my opinion. This doesn't seem like a switch just for the sake of a switch. It seems like a switch with justifiable reasons. And I will say that there are some benefits to the switch, or some points that help sweeten the blow. So you're still using the same mounting compatibility for CPU coolers. So your old TR4 cooler can work perfectly fine on this STRX4 socket, so you can bring that along. We've already mentioned the link between the CPU and the chipset, but the TRX40 chipset itself is different to X399 that it replaces. It's actually quite similar to X570, which is built on the 14nm Global Foundries process technology, and the features you get are roughly similar. So clearly the chipset itself is very connectivity heavy. The bandwidth capability and the lane counts that you get with the new STRX4 socket chips, the TRX40 platform, it is on a completely another level from what we've seen from other high-end desktop platforms. It's also worth pointing out that because this is fundamentally the same chipset, or very similar to X570 and built on that 40nm GlobalFoundries technology, AMD quotes the maximum TDP as 15 watts for the chipset, so we are likely to see, like we've seen with X570, motherboards equipped with a chipset fan. I want to go into the chip configuration with the chiplets and the I/O die in more detail because I think that's important for Threadripper 3000. Now I'm going to try and breeze through here in the video, but make sure you go over to the Kick Guru website and check out the full written review for more details on why this is important. Fundamentally, the previous Threadripper 2000 parts of the WX were multiple Ryzen chips glued together, if you like, or connected via Infinity Fabric. So the problem when you had the 4-die chips, so the 2970WX and the 2990WX, was that you had some chiplets that had cores only and no real direct access to memory controllers or PCIe lane generators, for example. So they had to go via Infinity Fabric to the other dies to be able to access the memory controllers. And this was because they were fundamentally cut down EPIC Naples parts. Here it's different. So these are very similar to EPIC Rome in the layout, where you get the core chiplets are cores and cache pretty much only. And then that central I/O die handles memory controlling, PCIe duties, and it's all connected via Infinity Fabric. And the key thing here is that no chips or no cores specifically are penalized for their position or their location. The I/O die itself is more similar to EPIC Rome's I/O die than it is to Ryzen 3000's, and it's physically larger, significantly larger than Matisse than Ryzen 3000 for Zen 2. It's built on the GlobalFoundries 12nm process, and it actually comes in at 416 millimeters squared with 8.34 billion transistors. You can see just how physically large that I/O die is. It's massive. It's comparable to something like, it's actually bigger than a GTX 1080. It's comparable to something like an RTX 2060. It is huge. With that said, the key difference to EPIC is that you get 4-channel memory for this I/O die for Threadripper versus 8-channel with EPIC, and you get 64 PCIe lanes here from the I/O die versus the 128 kind of asterisks, because you get some more with EPIC, but versus the generally 128 plus with EPIC. Also, because you're only using 4 core chiplets versus 8 core chiplets, or up to, I should say, 8 core chiplets with EPIC, you get 4 Infinity Fabric connection points to the I/O die, although that may be different when the 64-core 8-chiplet version of Threadripper comes online next year. We'll have to wait and see. So the I/O die for Ryzen Threadripper 3000 is clearly large, it's clearly complex, it's probably not all that cheap to physically manufacture because of the sheer size, but it is an absolute stroke of genius. And I can say this quite confidently because I've already seen the performance figures at the time of shooting this, but it alleviates so many of those issues that you saw with cross-chiplet communication with the previous Ryzen 2970WX and the Threadripper 2990WX. You just don't really get that because everything gets fair access to the I/O die. When it comes to competition for Threadripper 3000, obviously at $1399 for the 24-core version and $1999 for the 32-core version, there isn't really all that much competition in the market. So the real comparison, I would say, is obviously previous generation Threadripper, which is set to undergo a price drop, we believe. I mean, it's already dropped on the likes of Amazon, Scan, overclockers, and also Intel's high-end desktop. Our new TRX40 test system utilizes the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme 2 motherboard, a brand new STRX4 offering with a high-performance power delivery solution and plenty of active cooling. We're using BIOS version 0601, which was provided to us by AMD for pre-release testing. This uses a GSA version Castle Peak Pi SP3R3-1.0.0.2. I hope somebody shortens that to just 1.0.0.2 because there's no way I'm remembering the rest of that name. For CPU cooling, we opted for the Cooler Master Wraithripper. We picked this dual tower air cooler with its 2700 RPM fan, as our previous internal testing by my colleague James has shown that air coolers with full cover Threadripper contact plates actually outperform AIOs that are not specifically designed for the extremely large Threadripper heat spreader. Our memory kit is a quad-channel 4x8GB kit of G.Skill Trident Z RGB 3200C14 memory. Gigabyte's beastly Aorus RTX 2080 Ti Extreme graphics card is used for pixel push-in power. We use a custom fan curve on this beast to minimize thermal throttling so we get consistency across platforms. Power is provided by the highly efficient Seasonic Prime Titanium 1000 watt power supply. Make sure you check out the Kikaroo website for more details on our test procedures, our test settings, our comparison platforms, and all the other details that you might have missed in this brief section of the video. When it comes to frequencies, the all-core speed that we saw on the 32-core 3970X generally tends to be around 3850 to 3950 MHz for all-core loading in its stock out-of-the-box configuration. For the 24-core 3960X, the lower core count part was able to use its power headroom to hover around 4025 MHz for our longer Blender Classroom and Cinebench R20 all-core runs. So just over 4 GHz on a 24-core and 3.85 to 3.9 or 3.95 GHz on the 32-core. Maximum boosts on the 3970X regularly hit 4500 MHz in our Cinebench R20 1T testing. The 3960X showed the same boost behavior with 4492 MHz being hit several times, but 4467 was still held far more consistently. Overclocking these chips was quite challenging just because they're such high core count parts and demand a lot of power out of the box anyway. It quickly becomes a battle against thermal headroom. Of course, if you have access to higher powered liquid cooling, and this seems like a good platform to invest in that, then you're probably going to be able to push further on the all-core frequency and the precision boost overdrive frequency. For the 3970X, we were limited to 1.275 volts in the UEFI using level 7 load line calibration, and this resulted in 1.248 volts under load according to CPU-Z. 4.1 GHz flat was the highest frequency we could hold stably at this voltage, and temperatures were hitting against the 100 degrees Celsius mark. For the 3960X, we found that 1.3 volts with level 7 load line calibration was manageable from a temperature perspective, and this resulted in 1.28 to 1.288 volts under full load. The voltage got us a stable 4.25 GHz across all cores here. For the 3970X with PBO plus 200 offset, the all-core frequency starts at about 4025 MHz for Cinebench and Blender, and then it settles to its stable point of about 4000 MHz. We went slightly higher on the one thread boost frequency, so we were sometimes up as high as 45, 41 MHz, and we were more consistently at 4500 MHz. So for the all-core loading with the 3960X using the same PBO plus 200 MHz OC, the chip started at 4167 MHz and then settled to about 4110 MHz average across all cores for our extended Blender Classroom and Cinebench R20 runs. And we actually saw the boost frequencies as high as more than 4500 MHz. Our performance testing in this review will focus on the stock Precision Boost 2 numbers using the Cooler Master Threadripper CPU cooler, and then also the PBO plus 200 MHz Auto OC. Starting off with Cinebench R15, we see AMD continue its highly competitive performance in well multi-threaded tile-based rendering software. Both the 3960X and 3970X set new levels of performance in this application, comfortably outperforming the best Intel and previous gen AMD high-end desktop competitors. Stock versus stock, the 32-core Zen 2 part outperforms its 32-core Zen Plus predecessor by an impressive 48%. 24-core versus 24-core, the 3960X wins by 39%. These victories are driven by architecture improvements for Zen 2 and, more importantly, higher operating frequencies that the efficient 7nm process enables. Versus Intel's $1,000 flagship Core i9-10980XE, the stock versus stock performance lift is 60% for the 3960X and 98% for the 3970X. OC versus OC, AMD's new 24-core is now 37% quicker than Intel's i9, and the 32-core flagship is 69% better. Single-threaded performance in Cinebench R15 is strong, just as we've seen with other Zen 2-based processors. AMD's high-end desktop chips are able to boost to 4.5 GHz or slightly higher with PBO, allowing them to throw a reasonable clock frequency at the workload. The higher clocked Intel Coffee Lake and Ryzen 3000 mainstream processors still rule the 1T chart thanks to higher operating speeds. Compared to previous generation Threadripper, the performance increase is substantial at 22 to 23%. The Cascade Lake X is beaten, but its stock operating mode puts up a decent fight thanks to the lofty 4.8 GHz maximum boost frequency for this single-threaded test. We see another performance demolition of the alternative processors by the new Threadripper parts in Cinebench R20. The 32-core 3970X hits almost 17,000 points out of the box, making it 52% faster than the 2990WX it replaces. The 3960X's lead over its 24-core predecessor is 42%. Compared to the $1,000 i9-10980XE, the 40% pricier AMD chip is 57% faster stock versus stock and 35% better OC versus OC. AMD's 32-core flagship offers almost double the lead in Intel Core i9 chips performance out of the box. As we saw with R15, Cinebench R20 single-threaded performance is strong with Threadripper 3000 thanks to the Zen 2 architecture and respectable boost frequencies. To beat out either of AMD's new high-end desktop flagships, you'll be looking at a highly clocked Ryzen 3000 AM4 processor or a 5GHz plus Coffee Lake chip. Even the Core i9-10980XE and its 4.8 GHz maximum single-core clock speed is handily beaten by the new Threadripper chips, and the performance gap to last year's Threadripper Zen Plus offering is significant. So next we'll look at blender performance, but bear in mind here that a render time reduction of 50% actually mathematically converts into a 100% performance improvement. If you can get the job done in half the time, that means you can do 2 times as much work in the same time as the slower part, therefore you get 100% more performance. The 3970X takes top spot, beating its next closest competitor, the 24-core 3960X, by 19% stock versus stock. Generationally, the render time decrease from the 32-core 2990WX to the 32-core 3970X is a hefty 30 seconds or 30%. That converts into 43% higher performance for the 3970X. The 3960X's generational render time reduction versus Zen Plus predecessor is 29 seconds or 25%, which converts into 34% higher performance. Compared to Intel's Core i9-10980XE, even the heavily overclocked Intel part cannot match AMD's Threadripper 3000 offerings, though AMD's chips are more expensive. The flagship Threadripper 3970X delivers a render time just under half of that of Intel's Cascade Lake X flagship. Translate that into a numerical value, and AMD's leader is delivering 103% more performance for its roughly 100% price increase. Stock versus stock, the 3970X beats its 2990WX predecessor by 92% and the Intel i9-10980XE by 54%. The lower performance for Threadripper 2000WX parts is tied to their unique memory controller topology that penalizes some cores with latency penalties for access and resources that are off-die. The central I/O chiplet design for Zen 2 and Threadripper 3000 clearly alleviates all such issues for Handbrake. Intel's high-end desktop parts come back with a strong fight when their sizable frequency headroom is leveraged. With the i9-10980XE overclocked to 4.6 GHz, the Threadripper 3970X running PBO has its performance lead cut to 9%, while the overclocked 3960X only maintains a gap of plus 8%. And when we see overall resource utilization drop even further on high core count chips in our Handbrake X265 workload, Intel's higher frequency headroom and robust AVX performance deliver the win. Granted, with all chips at stock, the 3970X and 3960X are faster than Intel's 18-core flagship. Remove the AVX-induced speed reductions by overclocking the Intel HEDT part and it enjoys a performance lead of 25% over AMD's $2,000 flagship. One key difference to point out here is overall resource utilization, with the higher core count Threadripper 3000 parts understandably having more free resources to do other tasks such as simultaneous video conversions, or gaming if you prefer. If your workload only requires single item video conversion and you cannot stack multiple tasks simultaneously, the 24 and 32 cores offered by Threadripper 3000 are clearly overkill. At least the performance increase over Threadripper 2000WX parts is massive thanks to the improved I/O topology. Despite Adobe Premiere Pro and Media Encoder commonly getting criticism for being poorly optimized to take advantage of high-end hardware, the Threadripper 3000 processors are actually able to offer the highest performance in our testing. We didn't have access to the Core i9-10980XE for this test unfortunately, however Threadripper 3000's performance improvement over the Skylake X18 core, even when that's overclocked to a lofty 4.5 GHz, is clear. Our H.264 YouTube 4K export isn't demanded enough to saturate the 24-core, 32-core Threadripper chips, as proven by the minor performance differences between the 3960X and 3970X. That leaves CPU cycles spare to work on other tasks such as Lightroom photo editing or Handbrake video conversion, while also exporting the Adobe Premiere Pro project. No memory or latency issues with these Zen 2 Threadripper processors were observed. The performance jumps over the 2970WX and 2990WX are colossal. AMD's Zen architecture has always been strong when it comes to file decompression, so it comes as no surprise to see the Threadripper 3000 chips delivering crushing victories in 7-zip decompressions test. The performance improvement versus Zen Plus predecessors is 80% for the 32-core and 56% for the 24-core. Both Threadripper 3000 CPUs also comfortably outperform the Intel high-end desktop flagship, with AMD's 32-core part boosted by PBO actually offering more than double the performance of Intel's heavily overclocked 18-core. Plentiful bandwidth and a high core count combined to deliver strong 7-zip compression performance for Threadripper 3000, especially when compared to the 2990WX and 2970WX with their off-die memory accessibility challenges. Versus the roughly $1,000 Intel high-end desktop flagship, AMD's $1,400 Threadripper 3960X is 39% quicker stock versus stock and 41% quicker OC versus OC. Memory bandwidth registers over 60 GB per second with our 3200 C14 DDR4 sticks in quad channel mode. One interesting trend that we observed for both Threadripper 2000X and Threadripper 3000 is the 24-core part consistently scores higher in the SciSoft test than its 32-core sibling. This is an odd and repeatable observation and could be related to the way in which the benchmark interacts with the memory on a per-core basis. Either way, you get a healthy serving of memory bandwidth from Threadripper 3000 without any clear headaches caused by the centralized I/O die and Infinity Fabric interconnects. Memory latency is, however, an area where the central I/O die seems to provide a performance penalty versus Intel high-end desktop and Threadripper 2000WX processors. If you have workloads that are particularly sensitive to memory latency, perhaps such as transactions for a high-frequency trade-in, Threadripper's higher latency versus even the Intel high-end desktop Cascade Lake X flagship is important to note. We'll have to see if this latency penalty has a significantly negative impact on gaming performance. We will breeze quickly through the 1080p and 1440p gaming results, as gaming performance is clearly of secondary importance to these processors. It's clear to see that the Ryzen Threadripper 3960X and 3970X are both perfectly competent gaming processors. That comes as no real surprise given that the central I/O die avoids memory and PCIe accessibility headaches that plagued Threadripper 2970WX and 2990WX gaming numbers. Overall, you get performance that is typically a bit slower than the mainstream Ryzen 3000 processors and their generally higher operating frequencies. Of course, that's when the gaming scenario is not GPU limited and the CPU performance differences are observable, such as high refresh rate 1080p gaming. Compared to the Intel high-end desktop flagship Core i9-10980XE, Threadripper 3000 generally loses out by a few percentage points for average FPS. The margins are small, but Intel's high-end desktop chip does beat out Threadripper more often than not. The Far Cry 5 and Hitman 2 results are lower than one would expect, with Far Cry 5 showing particularly sporadic performance from boot to boot. An easy way to fix this is to apply game mode within Ryzen Master, reboot the system as required, and drop down to 8 cores 16-thread operation. This boosted our Far Cry 5 FPS numbers on the 3970X to 113 FPS average at 1080p and 110 average at 1440p. Hitman 2 was also boosted to 110 FPS average. Clearly, game mode is not required to deliver solid gaming performance in most titles, as was the case with Threadripper 2000WX series. It is now more of a troubleshooting feature that can be used when the odd game here and there decides it doesn't want to play nice with these high core count chips. There's no reason why Threadripper can't be used to deliver a smooth gaming experience that is comparable to mainstream Ryzen processors. That is, unless you count every last FPS in your game, of course. We'd say that perfectly good gaming performance with very few real areas of concern is a nice bonus for $1,400 and $2,000 high-end desktop chips. The 280-watt TDP chips demand around 410 watts of system-wide power from the wall when running Cinebench R15 and just under 400 watts for the Blender Classroom render. This puts their power consumption numbers higher than the 250-watt TDP 2970WX and 2990WX they replace, albeit with significantly higher operating clocks. Compared to Intel's 36-thread Core i9-10980XE, operating in its 3.8 GHz multi-core turbo mode that is enabled when XMP is applied, both Threadripper parts command around 80 watts more system-wide power. That's quite a sizable chunk of additional energy, though it must be viewed with reference to AMD's higher Cinebench performance also. Overclocking the HEDT chips forces Intel's 18-core parts to the bottom of the chart, with our 4.6 GHz 10980XE registering over 500 watt system-wide power draw when running Blender. The Threadripper 3000 chips weren't far behind, with their Cinebench numbers hitting around 480 watts system-wide, and software reporting 345 to 365 watt CPU package power draw. Put simply, AMD's Threadripper 3960X and 3970X demand a lot of power, which puts emphasis on a quality motherboard VRM, a good CPU cooler, and a solid power supply. Factoring in performance for those sizable power requirements, both Threadripper chips show the superb efficiency that we've come to expect from Zen 2 and 7nm. The power efficiency improvements for Threadripper 3000 versus Intel's cheaper Cascade Lake X flagship are sizable in Cinebench. Even the 24-core 3960X registers as higher efficiency than the Core i9-10980XE. Based on retail prices in the UK as of week commencing 18th November 2019, we can see that the performance per pound for Threadripper 3000 is pretty low given the high asking prices. This is stark contrast to AM4 Ryzen 3000 that generally offers superb performance value using our Cinebench data. Clearly, AMD is charging a price premium for such high core count processors. This chart also doesn't factor additional value-added features such as PCIe lanes, memory capacity, all of which command a price premium but do not contribute to Cinebench scoring. Whichever way you look at it, AMD's Ryzen Threadripper 3000 processors offer highly competitive performance, but AMD most certainly expects you to pay appropriately for that privilege. We use the Cooler Master Wraithripper air cooler as its base plate is designed specifically to provide full coverage on Threadripper. As a note, all comparison non-Threadripper processors are cooled using the Corsair H100X 240mm AIO, so results are not directly comparable. but they're charted for completeness. Despite the toasty 280-watt TDP for both Threadripper 3000 CPUs, their operating temperatures at stock are very reasonable. With stock temperatures at around 80 degrees Celsius or below, there is clearly headroom to push the chips a little further by opening up the power budget. Precision Boost Overdrive feeds extra power and elevates the clock speeds. Staying below 95C, even when overclocked, proves that you don't need to break the bank when budgeting for cooling of these 24 and 32 core processors. Our £120 Wraith Ripper did a good job, but we'd wager that Noctua's £75 U14S TR4 would deliver equally stellar cooling. Unsurprisingly, with Ryzen Threadripper 3970X, AMD is convincingly taken the performance crown. It is significantly faster than everything else on the market when you really can push those cores, so in tile-based rendering tasks especially, but even in tasks that are demanding but don't necessarily push all of the cores, is still showing really, really good performance, even versus the 18-core Intel flagship, the 24-core sibling, and the previous generation Threadripper part. The performance improvement versus previous gen Threadripper is absolutely massive in certain scenarios, and the reason being is because of that really smart configuration with regards to the core-only chiplets and the central I/O die. And if we focus on the 24-core 3960X, then that also hands the Intel 18-core 10980XE flagship a rather handy beating. And to be fair, we should expect that. It's 40% more expensive than the Intel flagship, so we should expect the beat in the reserves, but a lot of the times the performance is more than 30-40% plus. So that looks like a really good entry point to the Threadripper 3000 platform at the moment. It's convincingly faster than the 10980XE. There are areas where you just really do struggle to stress 48 and 64 threads. So Handbrake in our X265 workload, Intel put in strong performance there and was able to leverage a performance lead thanks to its superior frequency when overclocked. So there are still scenarios where you will struggle to use all of these cores, and if you cannot stack your single-threaded or lightly threaded or even heavily multi-threaded but not fully utilized workloads, if you can't stack those side by side, then the value perspective pretty quickly erodes for these chips. Now that's perfectly understandable. Not everybody's going to be able to use and leverage a 24-core or 32-core chip. I think if you can, you probably know you can. But if you can leverage an 18-core chip, you probably say that there's going to be a pretty reasonable chance that you can also leverage 24, 32, maybe in the future 48 or 64 cores. I think one point that really needs to be noted for the pricing is clearly $1399 and $1999 are steep, but last year Intel was charging $2,000 roughly for the 18-core Core i9 9980XE. So if we look at this 32-core $2,000 versus the 18-core Skylake X at $2,000, as we've shown in our charts, it just obliterates it most of the time. It's just a completely different level of performance. Clearly Intel has now put itself into a more aggressive pricing position by dropping the prices significantly with Cascade Lake X, and that does become a bit of a challenge for Threadripper 3000. You do really have to ask yourself, can you use 24, can you use 32 cores? Obviously, the counterpoint to Intel's aggressive pricing is when you look at the bigger picture, so not just the CPUs, but the platform as a whole. So STRX4 and the TRX40 platform is night and day. It is completely better. It is just far, far superior to any other platform on the market. It's just a very feature-heavy platform. Now, if you just want cores and memory bandwidth and you don't care about that, fine. But if you do care about I/O, about connectivity, about Gen 4 devices in the future, higher speed SSDs, critical storage arrays coming off your chipset, TRX40 is a really, really impressive platform, really impressive. If we talk about value, then as is basically clear looking at the performance perspective, if you are doing work that needs more cores, that can get you faster render times, that can complete your simulations quicker, that can mean your programs compile quicker, if you're doing that, and you are in an environment where you're charging for your time or where your business wants to expand profitability, wants to cut down, wants to become more lean, these are good ways of doing it. So yes, they're expensive chips. We know that. Everybody's commented on that. And yes, they're perhaps a bit higher priced than we thought they were going to be. But AMD is now clearly the leader when it comes to high-end desktop, and they are charging a price premium. Now, the enthusiast inside you might think, oh, well, you know, I wanted a cheap chip. And yeah, I mean, I'd love it if these were a bit cheaper because they are quite expensive, let's not deny it. But you are getting significant value, especially when you look at the performance. So if you can pay $400 extra for the 24 core versus Intel's 18 core, and you can save 2 hours a week on your render times, you can save 2 hours a week on your simulation, you can compile programs an hour quicker, so you save an hour worth of compile time or an hour worth of your consultant time per week. That can pay for itself pretty quickly. It's not going to be the case if you're playing games or if you're just rendering videos from your holiday because you're an enthusiast, but if you are charging for your time, and the charge for your time is through high value work, the ability to do your work quicker and more efficiently, and therefore get through more work or have more downtime, be able to enjoy watching the football on the weekend, be able to shut off earlier in the evening, there is clear value to that. So AMD's price premium in that situation will be very, very justifiable to a lot of people. Anyway, to summarize, the 24 core is an absolute beast. The 32 core is the fastest you can buy on the high-end desktop workstation market without going specific server chips. They're just out and out beasts. If you've got really demanding workloads that will benefit from high performance CPUs in a single socket, if you need tons of cores for rendering, if you need tons of cores for video editing and simultaneously video converting, if you're doing simulation, if you're doing programming, if you're doing those really demanding types of things, or you want to run virtual machines or a server, these are absolutely superb choices. They are realistically, in my opinion, what last year's Threadripper 3970X and 3990X should have been, because the stroke of genius with the central I/O die and the Zen 2 architecture means that these are basically no compromise performance across the board. The biggest challenge with them is finding workloads that will saturate those 24 and 32 cores, and that is certainly not a bad problem to have. So I've been Luke Hill for Kit Guru. I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure you give us a like and a subscribe. Make sure you let us know what you think in the comments below. I know this has been a pretty long one, but it's a lot to discuss. But make sure you go onto the Kit Guru website and check the full written review and see more details over there and more charts. If you want to help support Kit Guru, then head on over to our merch store or go to our Patreon where you can support us there. And I'll see you in the next one.